Okay, we've finished the last presentation a week ago, talking about a declining energy return on investments that I had actually spoken to British Parliament about this. And in fact, what I said at that presentation has come to be the case. Their major oil fields in the North Sea have basically gone, some of them have gone to zero. And they're using smaller and smaller oil fields, which are going to close to zero. And England is in a very tough spot with respect to oil compared to what they had been before. Here is estimates of gain and costs with different axes, and the energy return on investment has basically been declining over time, and this has continued to the present day. But this is what I presented at the Parliament, and it may not look like much of a decline, but it's gone down from about 30 to 1 to about 15 to 1. And here was another, other people in England undertook this analysis as well and came up with pretty much the same results, with some sensitivity analysis as to exactly what we're looking at. But everywhere around the world, the energy return on investment of our principal fuels is declining. On a more hopeful note, possibly the ROI of solar and wind turbines and so forth is increasing. And that might be considered hopeful, except it's usually only about 5 or 6% of the total energy. I mean, it may be 20% of electricity, but electricity is only 20% of total energy use. So solar so far hasn't made much of a dent, but there are some optimistic signs it may be increasing rapidly, and it may not be. And I'm very much involved myself in trying to understand these issues and making sure that the energy return on investment is done properly. So I'm going to go on, and I just want to mention that I ended the lecture last time by saying the environmental impact of all fuels is usually not included in the ROI equations. And for example, this is a Louisiana oil field in which the pulling out of the oil and the digging of canals and other things has led to a subsistence of the land and a loss of very productive marshlands. The water is much less productive than the grasses that used to be there.
Recording in progress.
This is the Venice oil field, the circle in the background, which is 5 miles across. The scale is enormous. And finally, energy return on investment will strongly influence net economic growth, cost of government, ability to pay back debts, ability of conventional economic models to work, and value of pensions, just for example. Okay, now, what I want to talk about next is something called limits to growth. And this is perhaps the most influential resource, I would say environmental, but I'm going to say more accurately resource book ever been done. And it was really the brainchild of Jay Forrester. He is not an author, but he had authored an earlier version of this called The Counterintuitive Behavior of Social Systems. It's a really remarkable study. And he was the inventor of early computer, what's called RAM, RAM, random access memory, in other words, computer memory. And he has an example of a very early computer memory in his hands in this picture. And 4 of his students and colleagues, notably Donella Meadows, also her husband, Dennis Meadows, Jorgen Randers, and William Behrens wrote this Limits to Growth, which I hope you've heard of, but you may or may not have, in 1972. And this was at a time when the world was all very bullish about growth, which of course is still the case, but growth meaning economic growth, social growth, growth of everything. And here's another picture of some of these people. And I used to know Donella, and especially Dennis, still do quite well. And Dennis is still writing about this, and I don't think he's changed his position a bit. And they made these very early computer curves before we had fancy graphing techniques. And what it showed was that over time, and this is 1900 to 2100, and this is a very important thing, that at that time, they didn't have means of putting in tick marks to indicate times. And they, as they ran their model, and they said they built their model to predict things accurately, but just to understand the relation among the variables, resources would be used up, food per capita would, the birth rates would decline, as they do with increasing affluence. And the death rates also especially would decline. But the difference between the two would be the growth of population, which continued to increase till some point. And then all of, this is pollution, all of the variables then began to, let's just say, change very abruptly. And the one that got people's attention was the human population was seen in this model to decline. Now, they did a lot of what's called sensitivity analysis, and changing their assumptions about how much resources there were, and the relation between energy and food production and so forth and so on. And they basically could not find a situation where there was a steady state of the population. In other words, instead of a sharp increase and decline, unless they did two things. They had to stop population growth, which in the computer you can do with a magic wand, and they had to stop investments beyond replacing what they had at the time. And, stopping investments, of course, was not very popular amongst economists. And when they did that, they could generate a relatively stable future in which it looked like you could build a world that you wouldn't be running out of resources, the pollution would be manageable, population would be stable, and so forth. Well, that was the results of their computer model. And I guess the important thing is the economists hated this model because they felt it left out human imagination and technology and market incentives that would overcome any important constraint of nature. And then when the violent oscillations did not occur, they dismissed the model and analysis. Well, here's just an example. I can't read the title here. Here, excuse me. Here's a group of economists by Ross and others, and they were from fancy places, Ivy League and so forth, and they critiqued the dickens out of this. But one of the things that they failed to understand initially, and I think still, is that they were making their criticisms back here between 1975 and 2000, and the oscillations were not supposed to have taken place yet. And even if you look at 2025, there have been a number of studies of this model, including several with my name on it, that have shown that the model is still remarkably accurate after almost 50 years. In fact, more than 50 years. Most of what the model has predicted, and there are more recent studies, and I can supply them to anybody who wants them, have shown that the model is doing pretty well. And if you look at pollution and think of CO2, for example, as a pollutant, or the sulfur in the air probably hasn't increased as much as this indicates, but still a lot. Water pollution depends very much on what part of the world you live in, but it's still increasing dramatically, for example, in Asia and Africa. The model, it seems, for the world as a whole, not too bad at all. The world population right now is 8 billion. Don't forget, this prediction was made in 1970. And here in 2025, the world population is 8 billion. It's almost right on the money. I don't think any economic model has been that good. And see, I got out a ruler and just put in a scale, and you began to understand what the predictions were. Now, are we going to have these violent oscillations somehow after 2025? Some of us might live long enough to find out. Certainly quite possible. Oh, here's Graham Turner has done an assessment of the predictions and the actual data. The predictions are in the dotted lines, and the actual data are in the solid lines for these different parameters. And you can see that for most of them, the limits to growth model is a pretty good predictor. I don't know what we can say about today, but just a couple of years ago, somebody named Brandenhurst, I think she was at Harvard, did an analysis and found that it was still pretty much on the money. That's her conclusion. So this is a very interesting model that's basically made a big splash in the early 1970s and then has been mostly ignored then, except for a few people. And you got to remember, Mother Nature holds the high cards. And we can see for oil, for example, that depletion is clearly trumping technology. So these things are yet to be fully determined. And what about technology? And I'm not going to go into all of that now, but I would like to leave you, before we shift to today's lecture, with this picture. And here's the news all looking at CO2 and climate change and so forth. But I think nobody in the media is talking about depletion, which I think is likely to be a much bigger impact on humanity, or at least equal as climate change. Okay, now I'm not going to do that. I'm going to shift. Let's see. Let me just ask, is there anybody have a question about the limits to growth at this time?
Charles,
Yes.
when you refer to a depletion, you're referring to depletion of fossil fuels, right? Like oil.
And many minerals like copper.
Oh,
Agricultural soils, groundwater. The depletion of groundwater is going to have a huge impact over the next 30, 50 years.
okay, that's interesting. Because my question was going to be, if your concern was fossil fuels, that would be an indication that you're not very optimistic that we will wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, at least as an energy source, and that we're going to face a big crunch in the future between what we need and what we can extract from the earth. Is that right? Are you
Oh, yeah.
basically pessimistic about that we're going to continue to be very reliant on fossil fuels for the
Oh, yeah.
foreseeable
And the
future?
transition, if we are going to build all these, if we're going to make this brave new world of running off of solar, PVs and wind turbines and so forth, um, it's going to cost an enormous amount of fossil fuels and oil in particular to put this together and to get it out into where it's being used and so forth and so on. We have pretty good estimates of ERI for some of these, and I'm still working on with others trying to define. Well, let me give you this. This was a section that I skipped over, and maybe I shouldn't. But here's a picture of global GDP is the dotted line, and the global consumption of coal and oil in the reddish and gas in the green and nuclear in purple and blue is hydropower, which is solar, and other, which is PVs and so forth. Now, this graph is a bit old, but it hasn't changed dramatically since then. And just look, I'm born in 1943, and our use of energy is we're at 1 bar, shall we say, one square, 1943, and a little more than one. And today we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. We're using 8 times the fossil fuel that we were using when I was a kid, when I was born. And that's just amazing. And here is the best estimate we have of all fossil fuels, including only the best ones. That's maybe the first one, but including all of the very low grade oils and coals and shale oil and everything like that, which we probably will never exploit because it'd be just too expensive. But these are 3 estimates, and they all show a very sharp peak before around 2050. And I think the data is more consistent with this lower estimate that implies a peak in our use of all fossil fuels now, or pretty close to now. And certainly we have reached a peak with oil, and with gas, not quite clear. And coal, there are two schools of thought as to how much coal is remaining, but the most recent estimates are not nearly as much as we once thought. But anyway, starting at the very latest at 2050, civilization is going to have to deal with this. Now, can they build renewables fast enough to replace that? It would be enormously energy intensive to make all this stuff. But maybe, and we certainly can learn how to use less. And there are very good arguments that for poor people, we don't want them to use less. We want to bring them up to a modest standard of living. Well, I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but that's where we are now. Okay, any other questions on oil resources and limits to growth, at least for the moment? Okay, now I'm going to try to figure out, minimize that, and I'm going to, whoops.
I guess if I were to show a cartoon of the wave crashing over the wave, right?
Yeah,
I'd have a even bigger wave over depletion, which is population growth, which which continues to grow until 2050. So what's driving all of this is population growth,
Yeah, well,
unfortunately.
it's a perfect storm, and I put on, or Eric's put on the site one paper we have on the perfect storm. Yes, all of these things will interact. Climate change will cause the sea levels to rise, and it takes a lot of oil to try to protect coastal communities from the sea level rise, and on and on and on. It's a perfect storm we have written to that effect. Okay, now let me get to today's 6. What here? Why is this not happening? I think this is where I want to be today. Yes. Okay. Now, we've given a background in terms of the geological record, the evolution of life and of higher organisms and of humans over time, how all of them are related to the energy available to them, including the biological production of natural ecosystems and that of early human communities and and early industrial, in the early industrial process. We've examined all of them, how human history is basically developing the technology to increase our ability to use other natural resources, starting with even spear points and knives as energy concentration devices, and hunting and gathering, and then the evolution of agriculture, then the finding out how to use fossil fuels and so forth. And that still continues, obviously, with a greater importance of electronics and computational stuff that may or may not be increasing our efficiency of using resources. That the jury is still a bit out on that. So we're going to talk today about how conventional economics has viewed this process of humans using resources to increase, to enhance their standard of living. And this includes their lifespan and many other things. Their health, their ability to travel, their ability to use resources from other parts of the world, and to have more water and to have more plant production, which is probably the crucial thing. Maybe the most crucial invention was the Haber process to give us nitrogen fertilizer. Now, it is very important to understand that what is considered and taught as economics today is only one of a variety of ways to think about economics. It is almost an accident that we think about economics as we do. And I'm going to develop how economists have thought about economics since the beginning of any thinking about economics. So here is economics. Here, you must remember, economies exist however we wish to simplify or summarize them for the purpose of our studies. So economies exist. They are ecosystems with humans as the top consumers, shall we say. And these two lovely ladies are having a cup of coffee without thinking thing one about the incredible energy intensity of growing coffee beans, which at one point in my life I studied in considerable detail. Or the fact that their clothes are almost certainly made from oil or gas, or plants that are grown using oil and gas to generate the fertilizer or whatever. And I often, let's say this lady has a bagel in her bag, and if we go through the process by which that bagel was generated, let's say she's in Ashland or New York City or whatever. Let's go to New York City where you'd have the best bagels. And where did that bagel come from? She might have paid, let's just say $1. I'm sure it's more than that now for a bagel. How did that bagel get to be in her hand? Well, it starts in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where somebody, a whole group of people, took natural gas out of the marshes of Louisiana, ran the Haber process, made nitrogen fertilizer, which is critical for growing wheat, put it into a barged it up the Mississippi River to Nebraska, where a truck came and took that bag of fertilizer and took it over to a farm where it was put into a tractor device and using more diesel spread over the landscape. And then the tractor went back and forth a few times to cultivate it and then harvest the wheat. And then that was taken to a central point in Nebraska and ground into flour, put into a bag, put on a train, and again, using diesel, taken to New York City or Ashland, where the baker used more energy to mix the flour with water and whatever else. And then use natural gas to run the oven, and then put the bagels finally into boiling water to give them that nice finish. Energy is used at every step of the way. So a dollar bill should say, pay to the bearer 5 megajoules of energy. Because without the use of energy, there would be no bagel. So we talk about gold as backing the dollar, but that was never truly the case. Because when the Spanish went to the New World and did horrible things to the people there and extracted the gold and brought it back to the Old World, they doubled its quantity in Europe, but they halved its value. It was just like printing more money. And that is because the energy that was used to produce goods and services in Europe in the 1500s did not change. It was still the action of the farmers, the fishermen, the foresters who cut the wood, that all of this did not change, even though you doubled the amount of gold in Europe. So what you did is just like printing more money. You halved its value. It's called inflation. Okay. Economics as a discipline did not exist before around 1900. Nevertheless, there were what we now today call economists, and they call themselves moral philosophers. And the first recognized school, quote unquote, of economics was mercantilism. And there were people who wrote about this at some depth. No name stands out, but it was an economic system of trade that spanned from the 16th century to the 18th century and was based on the idea that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and trade. And what it really was a scheme, as many economic systems are, to justify and enhance the point of view of a particular, usually elite component of society. And in this case, mercantilism was the idea that we wanted to increase the power of the monarchy, with the wealth of the monarchy. And it was the duty of the king to protect production, jobs, and state revenues, and to enhance what they called treasure. Other people might call ripped off goods from other parts of the world, or perhaps certainly plenty of legitimate trade items, such as New England timber for British industrial products. And they had a plan in which to have the colonies, and this was during a period of colonization, in which the mother country would trade with their colonies, but would restrict the trade between the colonies so that as much wealth and power would accumulate to the mother country. And this was the first recognized, let's say, written down thought about the economy as a whole. And how it worked basically were here were the mother countries in Europe, and here were the colonies in various parts of the New World, and the mother country exported manufactured goods and got back fish, timber, tobacco, and so forth to these countries. And as we said in the previous lecture, due to the nature of the winds, very often there was a three-pronged process by which the manufactured goods would go to Africa and traded for slaves, and slaves would come to the New World and used in agriculture to grow cotton and sugar and other things, and that was then brought back to the New World, etc. So, and a very important in all of this was the spice trades coming from this part of the world, where grew very exotic things that were very valuable per pound back in Europe. Now, here's a picture of the British having a quote-unquote treaty with India, which was often enhanced, shall we say, with muskets from especially the British, as British colonized India. But here's a rather glamorized view of the relation between England and India, which ultimately led to just full exploitation. It looks like the elephant has some kind of eye that maybe this is not quite such a good idea as it may seem. And trade in general was enhanced by, remember, this is all powered by the sun in the form of the wind. And here's again, romanticized view of the trade, the importance of trade in the economies of early countries, early from our perspective. This was painted in 1639. Okay, now, what is generally recognized as the first school of economics, although they did not call it back then, were the physiocrats. And this was especially in France. And the most important guy was Quenay, this Queusnay. I think that's this guy here on the left. And they talked a lot about free markets. They thought the king should not control the markets, that the markets should control themselves. And maybe the most important thing they believed in was that all wealth came from the land. And we'll come back to that. All wealth came back from the land. And probably that was pretty much true back then, because the wealth came in the form of food, fiber, clothing from sheep, and heat from wood that you burn in your fireplace, and so forth and so on. So they thought all wealth came from the land, and they were not called at that time or a little bit later, they were not called economists. They were called moral philosophers. And we'll come back to that term, moral philosophers. And Quesnay was the king's physician, and he saw similarities between the flow of goods and services and the flow of blood in the human body. And he made these kinds of diagrams with economic goods going from one, say, from the agricultural class to the class of proprietors and class of artisans and so forth. And there was certainly thinking about how the economy worked, and really were thinking what I would call in a biophysical perspective. And again, the important thing was they believed that all wealth ultimately came from the land. And here you've got a picture of the land in the bottom implying that. And they tried to regulate the finances of France, and they said the French government was overspending because of the exorbitant expenditures of the royal house. And he said it's going to come back to bite you, and it did. Obviously, the guillotine and all. And he thought that they were advising the government to institute a policy of retrenchment through deep cuts in spending. And he told the king that he realized the anger he could expect from those who had become accustomed to financial favors, privileges, and subsidies from the government. Well, if the shoe fits, wear it. I think we're in a situation where so many people, I was talking about this coming back from the theater last night with my sister, who may be watching this, and my wife, that so many young people today just take it for granted that they're going to have all this food, all this transportation, all of this theater, whatever, for the rest of their lives. They what's the word, that they are entitled to all of this stuff? Well, all entitlements, like everything else, comes from our use of oil. And that future is, as we've discussed, pretty scary. So Turgot, one of these physiocrats, almost saved France from the French Revolution, but was defeated by, I can't read what's below that. But anyway, the wealthy who did not want to see their luxuries reduced. And you go over and look at the houses over there that they've preserved to today, and they were certainly very, very elegant. And oh, that's right. And the physiocrats were in favor of free trade, totally free trade. And we'll come back to that again and again. And it was called laissez-faire in French, leave alone. Don't interfere with the merchants. This just some additional things here. Do not attempt to fix the prices. Only competition can regulate prices with equity. And we still argue these things today. And do not, Quesnay says, stop, my friend, stop, and do not be misled by political speculations that aim to persuade you that in commerce you can take advantage at the expense of other nations. For a just and good God has seen to it that that is impossible. So again, this is economists are, although they weren't called economists then, are pulled out of the closet in order to justify exploitation of one nation of another. And here's the laissez-faire. Okay, the next big school of economics was called the classical economists. And they existed from roughly a little before 1800, let's say 1790 or so, until about 1870 or 1880. Now, one of them is Thomas Malthus, which probably most of you have heard, and he's best known for his theory that population growth will always tend to outrun the food supply, and that betterment of humankind is impossible without stern limits on reproduction. And this thinking is commonly referred to as Malthusianism. But he said, due to the passion between the sexes, he did not think that humankind would limit their numbers, and hence was ultimately going to be restricted by overpopulation. And his basic concept was that population could grow exponentially 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. That's called exponential growth. It's a constant rate on an increasing stock in mathematical terms. But that resources could only at best increase linearly. Now, he had no particular information to make that mathematical observation, but it was commonly considered at that time. And so, excuse me, well, there you have it. That's Malthusianism. And he was not a really pleasant guy, in not in other ways as well, but although he was a vicar, I think. Now here, the most famous economist of all times is Adam Smith, and he wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And he's on the 20-pound note of England. There's statues of him all over the place. And here's a picture of, I guess, what he looked like. And he is known mostly for one statement, which is not characteristic of his writing. But this is what he said. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. This line, which is really maybe the most important line ever said in economics, is used as an argument to enhance laissez-faire, that every person in the economy is trying to make a living, trying to make some profit. And in so doing, they will do so by producing goods and services that will be of value to other people and who will pay for that. And that's all you need to allow the economy to operate properly. Now, Adam Smith did not say that. He was not exactly a conservative in today's sense. He said such things as, it is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. In other words, tax the rich at a higher rate than the poor, which is people are talking about again today, and which they talked about when I was a young fellow and so forth. He also said an interesting quote, virtue is more to be feared than vice, because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience. Well, I'm not quite sure what that means, but that's what he's saying. Now, Smith also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And if you think of Smith from that earlier book, this is a completely different perspective, which he advocated till his death, as I understand it. And he was interested in the human capacity for benevolence. And so he said, the greatest prudence, Smith suggests, may lie in following economic self-interest in order to secure the basic necessities. But this is only the first step. He did not particularly trust businessmen, because he said the interest of businessmen is always in some respects different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce, which comes from businessmen, never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men who have generally an interest to deceive and oppress the public. So Adam Smith, who many contemporary conservative business people and politicians seem to love, was quite suspicious of unregulated markets. Very few people understand that. Part of the irony of economics. As an aside, about this time was the Battle of Waterloo. And the Battle of Waterloo meant that the relatively conservative English view would continue throughout history, as opposed to the relatively, quote unquote, in today's terms, liberal Napoleonic perspective. Napoleon may have been, well, he was certainly quite a general, but he was also a great institutor of progressive changes in the governing of France. And one thing I particularly appreciated is he initiated the development of the metric system, which is a fantastic way of measuring, weighing, and so forth, various things. He was very progressive in terms of health, in terms of the welfare of women and families, and in many other things. If he had not made himself emperor, who knows? But he did ultimately lose at the Battle of Waterloo, and that was it for Napoleon and his progressive ideas. And the more conservative perspectives of the English were what went on to guide, shall we say, economics into the future. Why is this not? Okay. Now, the next great economist was David Ricardo, one I particularly like. And here he is, nice looking fella. And he was a Spanish Jew living in London who was very much opposed to what are then called the Corn Laws, which basically made it very difficult to import grain from France, which was an agriculturally much more productive country, to England. And he thought that trade would enhance the value of both parties involved, and wrote about that in considerable detail. And still very interesting ideas to think about. His main contributions were the principles of comparative advantage, which means if you grow grapes better in Portugal and wool better in Scotland, then Scotland should trade wool for wine from Portugal. I haven't heard of any good wine from Scotland, so it sounds like a pretty easy conclusion. The one I like a lot is the principle of diminishing marginal utility. And as populations increased and there were more and more farmers, the first farmers would use the best land, say near the river in the valley. where the river had deposited good soil over many years. And then as the populations expanded, the farmers would go up the river and up the slopes into ever poorer land, and the average per capita production would decline. And in general, that the more of something you use, the lower the quality. I would say the lower the energy return on investment, and I certainly see that happening every day. Very pro free trade, and he and Smith introduced the labor theory of value, that value came from workers. John Stuart Mill was the next important one, and he was an exponent of utilitarianism. If it works, use it. The most widely read liberal argument in support of the value of liberty. So these concepts of liberty began to get all mixed up with economics. And the despotism of popular opinion. So these ideas are with us today. Now, at that time, poverty in England was huge. Most of these people were English, and Charles Dickens pointed out and dramatized this. And so I think novelists were much more influential than economists in reducing human misery. Economists claimed to do that, but that was not the case. Karl Marx, we've all heard of, and he was, I guess he was originally German, living in England, and very, very interesting guy. I'm not going to go into Marxism in any detail, but I think he was a very good source of understanding of capitalism. Much more, he understood capitalism far more than he understood communism, about which he actually wrote much less, although he advocated that certainly instead of capitalism. He wanted to spread the wealth. And he simplistically saw two main classes of people: the bourgeois, the owners of property, and the proletarians, the workers. And again, that's with us today. And he thought there was a scientific theory of progression of economics from 6 stages: primitive communism, to a slave society, to feudalism, to capitalism, socialism, and finally global stateless communism. Well, he advocated as scientific. There's no science that says one should necessarily follow the other. But he did emphasize the importance of class struggle in economics, and that's very important. Marx thought his ideas were most appropriate for industrial societies, for England and Germany, but he would have been very surprised to see them taken up by supposedly backwards Russia and China. And in fact, communism has mostly been used by strong despots to consolidate their power. And that continues my own perspective that economics is usually used to justify the advantage of those with power to take stuff away from those with less power. So the thinkers from Smith to Marx, or maybe Malthus to Marx, generally are called classical economists today. And they all believe that in the labor theory of value, that economic value comes from the activity of laborers. And most certainly Ricardo, but all of them, including Marx, understood the importance of energy, although they didn't write about it very much. But you can find it in their writings if you look. And Marx did say, in modern agriculture, as in modern industry, the mobility of labor is purchased at the cost of laying waste and debilitating labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. So he understood, as any intelligent person did at that time, that the action of economies was destroying the basis for the economies. Oh, too many words here. But neoclassical, the critiques of Marx are numerous, and I won't go through that. There's too many words, but a lot of criticisms of Marx have come along, and yet, and people have thought that Marxism has disappeared, but in the world, but in economic thought, Marxism is a very legitimate approach to thinking about economics. In, for example, Mexico, I was invited to an economics department of the University of Guadalajara, and I walk into their economics department, and they have a picture of Karl Marx, a big picture of Karl Marx on the wall. So there are many people who continue to use Marx's ideas in an attempt to understand economics and to improve the lot of the average person in their countries. Okay, then something big happened, and this is where today's economics comes from. Now, I want you to think about the fact that there are many different economists that I've talked about, the most important ones, that have looked at economics in various ways, I would say as an ecosystem, as the flow of goods from the land to the factories to the consumers and so forth, and have tried to understand this, and even tried to understand how we can better the average person's relation to these things. But those economists could not solve this question, the water versus diamonds paradox. And that is what actually sunk conventional economics. And this is, nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. And scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scare any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may be frequently had in exchange for this. Adam Smith said this, and he could not resolve that. None of the classical economists could resolve this paradox, and because of that, many people criticize that they did not understand how value and economics actually worked, and therefore thought that one should not pay attention to them. Well, along came three people. William Stanley Jevons, remember, we've already talked about him in Jevons' paradox, that if you make something more efficient, it'll end up using more, not less coal or whatever we're dealing with. And also Carl Menger and Leon Walras all wrote about the same time, 1870 or so, a resolution to the diamonds versus waters paradox. And it came through the idea of diminishing marginal utility. And it works something like this. If we look at the graph, that if this is liters of water, Q, quantity. So if this is the quantity of water, the first liter of water, you will pay essentially per day, you will pay essentially anything for that because you need it to drink and to live. The second liter of water, you pay a great deal for because you need it to cook your food or wash your face or whatever. And the 10th or the 100th volume liter of water on a day, you pay quite a bit for, not as much as the first one. It has diminishing utility to you at the margin meaning the point where you are at that time, so that by the time you get to the 8,000th liter of water, the less it was worth almost nothing to you. So each resource or each item was worth less and less as you had more and more of it. And what they did was they developed these curves. Oh God, let's go back to this one. And the idea was that the cost, as you had more and more, would go up exponentially. And where the two curves met would be the price. And this is the basis of much of, maybe in a certain sense, all of economics today, is people worry about what something is worth to the buyer in the market and the seller in the market, as derived by changing marginal utility to each. And they make these mathematical equations. I'm not going to attempt to explain them, but from this, in theory, you can supply mathematically, you can do all kinds of lovely mathematics, supposedly based on human subjective tastes as expressed in markets. And the thing they said was, well, this is democratic because everybody can interact in the markets and get what they value the most without anybody telling them what to buy. Well, this is only partially true because, of course, a poor person doesn't have much money to interact with in the market, but never mind these annoying details. So the idea of consumer sovereignty was associated with or conflated with individual freedom. Certainly Ronald Reagan did that a lot. And many economists combined Adam Smith's free markets and laissez-faires to give the maximum benefit to consumers. It is called Pareto optimality. And even though what it did, Pareto optimality meant that economists then abandoned their interest in the morality of economics. Any logical difficulties were considered or shoveled off as externalities. And something called the Mount Pelerin Society in the Austrian school, and a guy named Frederick Hayek developed this, and which is very, very much alive in today, and often is used as a cornerstone of conservative thinking. So I'm going to stop here today. This is the kind of economics that we are living with today. And well, I'm going to make you just one more point, and then we'll open it for discussion. This is the basic equation or basic picture diagram of how economies work that you'll find in chapter 1 of essentially every introductory economics book ever made recently in the last 100 years or last 50 years. And it shows only households and firms, and households providing land, labor, and capital to firms, and firms supplying goods and services to households, and the money going around in the opposite direction. And that's it. It's called the circular flow model. And it's maybe you might think, well, they certainly can't use this at higher levels of economics. Well, it's the basis of most complex neoclassical, that's the school of economics today, since 1870, since the marginal revolution, when the the diamonds versus water paradox was resolved. And I just like to say, we're going to skip. I'm missing something here. Sorry. Hang on. I just want to say I'm very unhappy with that. And how do I get out of this? Escape. And I want to say that this diagram, I guess I don't have my more complex diagram in this. That's next week. Sorry. But this has no land, no resources, no energy. It's a perpetual motion machine. It simply cannot represent a real economy. And so next week's lectures will be about the neoclassical, will be about biophysical economics, something I have been associated with, which attempts to bring the natural sciences into economics to make a more realistic view of how we should think about economics. And so this view of economics from the perspective of a natural scientist is impossible. It cannot exist. It does not represent real economic systems, which must be subject to the laws of thermodynamics and the law of conservation of matter, but which this is not. So I'll leave that there now and go to anybody who might have some questions.
I'll ask one. Well, it's not a question, it's a comment, I guess, or observation. When Frederick Hayek published his book, Road to Serfdom, that was 1945, right around the end of World War II. And at that, almost precisely synchronous moment in economics was the publication of another very profound book that is now becoming much more widely recognized, which was Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. I don't know if you've ever encountered that, Charles, but it was kind of overlooked in favor of Hayek's book because he was basically saying what Hayek would have vigorously opposed, although maybe not disagreed with, but it was ideologically very very much resisted in that he was basically saying that the whole history of capitalism was also the history of regulation. That capitalism and regulation went hand in hand. That capitalism, unfettered capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, was a myth, and that capitalism could only exist with the heavy hand of government managing its many negative unintended consequences. And it was a very it is becoming a much more influential book today, partly because some of those unintended consequences include environmental consequences. So I just thought I'd point that out. That economics is a creature of fashion, and it does change, but when it must, not when it should. And I think environmentalists are becoming much more fashionable in that we are now recognizing problems with classical economics and neoclassical economics that was not recognized or was not convenient to recognize earlier. So that's what my only comment on that.
Well, Charles is muted, so maybe he had to leave for a moment.
Charles, did you disappear from us? Maybe he went for a bathroom break. Uh,
Charles, if you're talking, you're muted.
Elaine, are you a co-host of this class?
I am not.
Oh, okay. All right.
I
Yeah.
asked him to unmute, but he's not, there's no response.
Oh, okay.
I'll bet he had to run to the restroom.
Yeah.
I hope he's okay.
So
Well,
Eric, did you say you were a co-host of
yeah,
this class? Okay. Well, do you have any comments on what Charles has presented? Oh, it looks like Charles may be back.
I'm doing that. I was just trying to
Oh,
see if I could share the screen, and it looks like I can. At any rate, this is going back to the beginning of limits to growth. This was
ah,
a study by Chris Ironoff, or I can't remember his name. At any rate, what he did was he randomly varied the inputs to the model, and the ones that correctly modeled the last 50 years he kept, and then projected them into the future. So millions of runs on the computer came up with this chart. All of the models correctly predicted the last 50 years, and then running them forward in time gave these results. The
wow.
very top of the mark is what the UN thinks the population will be in 2001, 2100. So all of the models said less. And the average is, of course, well, the average of what you're seeing, all the different ones, would be, these are possible futures according to what's called the World Core model. Just was an interesting
So
variation.
this is strictly population on the
No,
X, on the Y axis, and
yes, this would
time
be,
on the X axis.
this is just looking at population, but it used all the other inputs and models and model. And it's the output would be population. So we're about where the red line is, near the climax of the system.
Yeah.
The UN says we won't climax the model population until 2086 or something, but that's the UN's demographer's point of view, which excludes negative feedback loops like increasing death rate. They assume that the death rate will continue to decline forever, and people will just live longer forever and so forth. There won't be any. Okay, let me see if I can make this go away.
But does it include possible positive feedback loops? I mean, doesn't that seem, I mean, for example, with progress in genetics, we are coming up with more and more therapies for cancer and other diseases. And it's quite possible that there are some of these positive feedback loops that extend the human uh, expected life might also be present to make population grow more like what the UN is forecasting. Doesn't that
On the other
seem
hand, we're
Let's
likely to see a lot more diseases and viruses that are going to take us out.
true?
It may
True.
end up balancing out.
Right, right. And the question is then you know, what is the net effect of the negative feedback loops and the positive feedback loops? And we
Mhm.
don't know yet which is going to be stronger, the positive or the negative, right?
Yep.
Right? We
The
have no way to
demographers,
predict.
the demographers are just projecting past trends into the future.
Yeah.
That's all they do. They're
Right,
not.
but I don't see if I were seeing attention to positive feedback loops as well as negative feedback loops, I would expect at least some of the runs to show much higher growth in population, maybe even above the UN forecast.
Well,
Right,
again, there are limits to growth. I mean, we have a limited finite planet here. And
right,
at some
right,
point, the population's going to peak because we can't support
right,
any more. And, we're still subject to plagues and
right,
we might, there might be wars that we're going to kill each other. A nuclear bomb might go off, take out a bunch of the population. It's very hard to predict all of that stuff. The world
right, right, right,
volatile right now. Everybody's
right.
beating up on everybody else in the world, well, 2 or 3 major conflicts. And what is it? Is it human greed that's at the basis of it? Putin wants to expand his empire, right? He wants to take back
Right.
Ukraine. There's the whole stuff in Gaza, just, insanity. And then, our country is split politically. Is that going to end up in some kind of civil war? It's impossible to predict, right?
Right. And see there's to me, maybe Eric, you've got another perspective on this, but it seems like there's tremendous uncertainty about what what the critical choke variable is that will constrain future growth. Uh and at what point does that take effect in terms of human population? So is the human population going to be limited at 8 billion or 10 billion or 15 billion? And will the crash be sudden or will it be gradual? We don't, these are great uncertainties in that I wonder if the model adequately captures, because it just looks like they are all showing decline at a certain point in time. Uh, Whereas it seems to me like that decline might be at a different point in the population curve, and the rate of decline might be quite a bit different from what's assumed. It could be a crash, like you hit a brick wall, or it could be a slow deceleration.
Well, that chart sort of showed both. There was one curve that was very steeply down for the population,
Yeah,
like a crash, and then there were more
right.
that were more gentle. So, I mean, if you look at all the factors and all the models, there's a huge range
Yeah,
in what's being
I would have
possible.
expected a even broader range than that. But it's all a matter of what the assumptions are going into the model.
All right. Well, I'm going to take advantage of the extra few minutes. I've got stuff to do. So,
Okay,
Charles is
yeah,
okay, and we'll see
yeah.
you
I hope
next week.
Charles is okay. Yeah. Alrighty, well,
Take care, you
bye.
guys and
Bye,
gals.
everybody.
Bye.